The philosophy of Francis Hutcheson was a great attempt to rescue an idea of happiness as grounded in virtue, an ancient idea indebted to the Stoics, but that was now articulated in the context of the Enlightenment, defended in a world that had seen Hobbes and Locke and Newton in their view of the human being. Hobbes' view of the human being as a naturally selfish, self-interested, desirous creature who could reach no final end, no summum bonum, highest good, because there was no teleology, there was no final purpose of human life, that felicity was the constant pursuit of desires in their various objects. His deeply materialist view of the human being stands at the beginning of the Enlightenment. And one trajectory of Hobbes' thought would reach its culmination in the middle of the 18th century, in a philosopher who represents the opposite strand of the Enlightenment from Hutcheson and the Scottish tradition, a French philosopher named Julien de la Mettrie. La Mettrie's philosophy is encapsulated in several of his works that he would publish in the late 1740s and the early 1750s. They were scandalous texts that resulted in his exile from various countries of Europe and led him ultimately to the court of King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who would be his only defender. La Mettrie's philosophy was quite explicit, and it would scandalize even philosophical radicals, even in the French Enlightenment. But nevertheless, it distilled into its purest form the Epicurean side of Enlightenment philosophy. La Mettrie carries to its logical conclusions the materialist philosophy of Hobbes, the view of humans as self-interested, desiring creatures. La Mettrie was himself a trained physician, and so he was deeply learned in the science of his day. But even more than that, he was deeply influenced by his experience as a physician, by what he had seen on the operating tables in his office. He would come to view human beings as purely physical organisms, and he would see his philosophy coming directly out of his medical experience. In fact, he would speak of the physician philosophers who only had the real understanding of what human beings were like. La Mettrie said that man is a machine. In the 1740s, he published a work that already earned him notoriety that was on the nature of the soul. And it argued that, in fact, the soul was purely a material thing, that humans were made of matter, and that there was no immaterial soul that was living on after a human being died. In 1749, he would publish another work in this vein, provocatively titled, Man the Machine. In it, he argues that human beings are complex machines and nothing more. They are, just like animals, kinds of robots, automata. He says that human beings are simply made out of the substances of their bodies. And in fact, he says humans are nothing more than complex machines. And there is a reason why theologians, who he says have nothing to tell us about humans, have to operate from speculative, a priori assumptions about the nature of humanity, because they don't actually know anything about what humans are like. He says the way to know what humans are like are to pull out the guts of a human. That's what he says. Then you get a real sense for what human beings actually are. He says that, in fact, we should only say what human beings are after having this kind of observation of what human beings are. And he is a great observer of what human bodies do. And his philosophical works catalog over and over the kinds of cases he's seen of bodies lying on his table. And La Mettrie argues that human beings are nothing more than physical, organic machines. And in many ways, his arguments presage Darwin and much 20th century thinking about the nature of the brain. He sees the mind is simply a property of the brain, that there is only physical sensation, that there is only organic matter that produces what we would call consciousness, and that all of this is ultimately reducible to matter, to chemical properties. And so in that way, Mettrie is far ahead of his time as a thinker. Mettrie's materialist philosophy and his radical and deliberately provocative claims that human beings are made out of the same stuff as all other animals, that we simply are a kind of higher order machine than other animals, was meant to provoke. And from this, Mettrie argues that the nature of man is to pursue happiness. He sees happiness as the pursuit of human beings. But he says in the very same sentence that nature has made all animals to be happy, the eagle soaring above and the worm crawling below. For Mettrie, there's little difference in these kinds of organisms. They're all meant to pursue happiness. They're different only in their level of complexity. Mettrie sees himself working in the tradition of Epicurus. And in the 1750s, he wrote a book called Discourse on Happiness, or Against Seneca, the great Roman Stoic. Mettrie saw his philosophical project to oppose the Stoics of his own day, who tried to defend the idea that virtue is happiness. For Mettrie, this is nonsensical. Happiness is pleasure, and it's a deeply, purely physical sensation. For Mettrie, the Epicureanism of the ancient world is an inspiration, but his view of the purpose of life is, in fact, far less, we would say, philosophical or refined, whereas Epicurus is skeptical about pleasures and, in fact, sees them as dangerous if they're the wrong kinds of physical desires. Mettrie says that pleasure is pleasure. It's all a sensation. It reduces to one kind of thing. People get pleasures out of different kinds of activities, but it's all pleasure. And it's deeply physical. It is desire. It is rooted in the same kinds of pleasures that can be had in sex. And Mettrie writes explicitly about sexual pleasure. So it's very different in some ways from ancient Epicureanism. But nevertheless, in its argument that the purpose of life is happiness, and this happiness consists in pleasure, it is anti-Stoic, and it is indebted to Epicureanism. Mettrie gives the most pure expression of this strand of the Enlightenment that would throw off the prejudices of the past, that would dethrone theology, that would see the human being as a material creature, and that would see the purpose of human being as a kind of happiness that is achieved through pleasure, reduced to its absolute and purest form. Now, there was an apocryphal story that Mettrie had died after a particularly extravagant bout of dining at the court of Frederick the Great. In fact, that he ate too much pâté of pheasant and died of his own overindulgence. It's not true, but maybe that is simply the kind of stories that people need when they're confronted with these sorts of radical ideas. Because Mettrie, even though he was scandalous in his own lifetime, is a representative of one of the strands of 18th century thinking about the nature of human life and the meaning of happiness. And his vision of happiness as a kind of pleasure would have important ramifications in the history of political thought.